All right, so you want to get the lowdown on Container Corporation of India's latest numbers.
Their quarterly results.
Exactly. We're diving deep into Concor's Q2 performance for fiscal year 2025, hot off the presses from the Bombay Stock Exchange.
We've also got some interesting questions here that should help us dig a little deeper.
Yeah, it's not just about what happened, right? It's about what it all means for Concor's future. And one thing that really jumped out at me right away, a second interim dividend. Now, that's not something you see every day. What do you think?
Oh, it's definitely a statement.
Mm-hmm.
You don't see that very often. They've announced a 65% dividend. That's 3.25 per share. And this is on top of the interim dividend that they already paid out.
Wow, so 2 in 1 year.
Yeah, companies usually use this as a way to signal strong performance and positive projections.
Oh, so they're feeling pretty good about things.
Seems like it.
So what exactly is driving this confidence?
So let's take a look.
Lead the way.
All right. When we talk about Concor, you got to look at their two main business segments. You've got XEM, which handles international container traffic, and then you've got domestic movement.
Makes sense.
And looking at the revenue figures, it's clear that XEM is the powerhouse this quarter. They pulled in 1,531.99 crore.
Wow.
Compared to 751.04 crore for domestic.
So international trade is really booming for Concor.
Absolutely. But how does that compare to last year? Did they just maintain the pace, or are we seeing real growth?
That's the question, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if we compare this to Q2 of the previous fiscal year, FY24 XM brought in 1,443.75 crore.
Okay.
While domestic actually dipped slightly from 746.65 crore.
Huh. So not only is XM leading the charge, it's showing some pretty solid year-over-year growth.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant jump.
Do we know what's driving that? Is it just volume? Are they moving significantly more containers? Or are there other factors at play, like changes in pricing?
It's a great question, and unfortunately, the press release doesn't give us that level of detail.
Yeah, too bad.
Yeah, it'd be great to have more transparency on that front. But considering India's overall economic growth and its expanding role in global trade, it's reasonable to assume that both volume and pricing are contributing to XIM's success.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so revenue's up, particularly on the international side.
Right.
But revenue's only part of the story, right? We need to look at profitability. What kind of shape are Concor's margins in?
Okay, this is where things get interesting.
Right.
When we look at profit before tax, both standalone and consolidated, there's a pretty impressive year-over-year increase for the quarter. Standalone jumped from 341.28 crore in Q2 FY24 to 492.33 crore this year.
Wow.
And consolidated profit followed a similar trend, rising from 347.1 crore to 492.75 crore.
Okay, so not only are they bringing in more revenue, they're also turning it into profit more effectively. That's the dream for any business, right?
For sure.
But hang on a second. I'm remembering some of those questions we have about rising operational costs. Doesn't that usually eat into profit margins?
You're absolutely right to bring that up. Rising costs are a real concern for businesses across the board, and Concor is no exception.
Right.
We see this reflected in their expenses, particularly related to rail freight, which is a major part of their operating costs.
So how are they dealing with this cost pressure? Are they just accepting thinner margins, or are they doing something about it?
Oh, they're not just sitting back and taking the hit.
Okay, good.
They're actively implementing cost management strategies to mitigate the impact of rising expenses.
Like what? Give me the inside scoop.
Well, one key area they're focusing on is operational efficiency.
Okay, I like it.
Think of it this way. They're all about squeezing more value out of their existing resources.
So less waste, more bang for their buck.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This could involve optimizing container movements, streamlining logistics, improving the utilization of their rail network.
So are these efforts actually paying off?
Well, while the press release doesn't give us specific metrics like container turnaround time or train utilization rates, the fact that their profit margins are holding steady, even with rising costs, suggests that these initiatives are having a positive impact.
That's encouraging. It would be great to see more granular data in future reports to really track the progress of these operational improvements.
Absolutely. More transparency on that front would definitely give investors and analysts a clearer picture of Concor's operational health.
All right, so Concor seems to be doing a good job of managing costs internally.
Right.
But let's step outside their own operations for a moment and look at the bigger picture. How did their results stack up against the competition in the Indian logistics landscape?
Well, that's where we need to bring in some industry knowledge, because the press release itself doesn't offer a direct competitor comparison.
Yeah.
The Indian logistics sector is incredibly dynamic right now, with a lot of players vying for market share.
So a lot of competition.
Oh, yeah. But based on these results, I'd say Concor is holding its own quite well. Their revenue growth, especially in the exam segment, indicates they're capturing a significant chunk of India's booming international trade.
So they're not just treading water, they're actually gaining ground.
It is.
Hmm.
And their focus on operational efficiency and cost management puts them in a strong position to navigate the inevitable challenges that come with operating in such a dynamic industry.
Okay, so we've got a company with a healthy top line, strong margins, and a solid competitive position.
Sounds good so far.
But the question that's on everyone's mind is, what does the future hold?
Yeah, what can we glean from these Q2 results about Concor's trajectory in the coming quarters?
Ooh, I like where this is going. Lay it on me.
All right, well, first of all, that second interim dividend is a powerful signal. It suggests that management is feeling very confident about their future earnings potential. They wouldn't be sharing the wealth if they weren't optimistic about their ability to continue generating strong profits.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so they're feeling bullish about the future. What else?
Their ongoing commitment to operational efficiency is another positive indicator. It suggests they're proactively addressing the cost challenges that are likely to persist, especially with the current global economic uncertainties. And let's not forget their strong performance in the exam segment. That positions them perfectly to capitalize on India's continued economic growth and its expanding role in global trade.
So all signs point to a positive trajectory for Concor. It sounds like they've got a solid foundation for continued growth.
Absolutely.
But I'm sure there are also some potential challenges on the horizon. Nobody gets a free pass, right?
You're absolutely right. There are always potential headwinds to consider. And some of the questions we have highlight specific factors that could impact Concor's performance moving forward.
All right, let's talk about those potential challenges. What are some of the things that could throw a wrench in Concor's plans?
Well, one area of concern is potential regulatory changes. The Indian government is always looking for ways to improve the efficiency and competitiveness of the logistics sector. So we could see new regulations that impact Concor's operations and financial performance.
So a bit of a wait-and-see situation on the regulatory front. New regulations could be beneficial, detrimental, or somewhere in between. It all depends on how Concor adapts and responds.
Exactly. A proactive and strategic approach to regulatory changes will be crucial. And we can't ignore those global economic uncertainties we mentioned earlier.
Right.
Those could also create headwinds for Concor, especially given their reliance on international trade.
All right, so we've got a company with strong financials, a positive outlook, and a healthy dose of cautious optimism. But what about the folks who are watching Concor's every move, the investors? How has the stock market reacted to this news?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, the press release doesn't provide any stock market data or analyst commentary.
A bummer.
Yeah. So we can't say definitively how investor sentiment has been affected.
Ah, it's too bad. It would be interesting to see the immediate market reaction. But I guess we can infer that a company performing this well and sharing its profits with investors is likely to be viewed favorably.
I'd agree with that assessment. A second interim dividend is often seen as a positive signal, and Concor's overall financial strength should bolster investor confidence. But of course, the stock market is a complex beast influenced by a myriad of factors.
Always got to factor in those market complexities. But speaking of strategic moves, did Concor outline any exciting new initiatives in their press release? Anything that hints at where they're headed next?
Well, while the press release doesn't delve into specific new initiatives, it does underscore their ongoing commitment to operational efficiency and cost management.
Okay.
And that's not just a buzzword. It's about constantly looking for ways to optimize their existing operations and squeeze more value out of every rupee.
So a continuation of their current strategy, but no major pivots or game-changing announcements just yet.
Precisely. But remember, sometimes the most impactful strategies are the ones that are executed consistently over time.
Right.
Concor's laser focus on operational excellence could yield some significant benefits down the road.
Slow and steady wins the race, as they say. But we can't forget those potential regulatory changes we were talking about earlier. The questions we have raise some interesting points about potential headwinds on that front. What kind of regulatory shifts are we talking about? And could they really throw a wrench in Concor's plans?
Well, the questions don't get into the specifics of these potential regulatory changes, but we know that India's logistics and transportation sector is subject to a lot of regulations. These regulations are often related to things like safety, environmental compliance, and licensing requirements. Any significant changes in those areas could certainly impact Concor's operations and financial performance.
So a lot depends on the specific nature of those changes and how Concor chooses to adapt. It's a reminder that even the most well-managed companies are operating in a dynamic and often unpredictable regulatory environment.
Absolutely. Regulatory agility is key in today's business world.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground here. Financial strategies, the competitive landscape, and the ever-present regulatory wildcard.
A lot to think about.
But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to shift gears for a moment and talk about a topic that's becoming increasingly important for companies in all sectors, sustainability.
Ah, yes, sustainability.
Yeah.
It's no longer a nice to have. It's a must have for any company that wants to thrive in the long term.
Absolutely. Investors, customers, and regulators are all demanding greater transparency and accountability when it comes to environmental and social impact.
Right.
So the question is Conper on board with this sustainability train? Are they making any notable strides in this area?
Well, the press release doesn't specifically address sustainability efforts in detail,
Hmm.
but given the growing importance of this issue, especially for logistics companies, I think it's safe to assume that Concor is exploring ways to incorporate more sustainable practices into their operations.
So we don't have the full picture of their sustainability journey just yet, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on in future reports. All right, so a lot to consider here. Concor is performing well, but they're also operating in a dynamic and evolving business environment where factors like regulation and sustainability are increasingly important. But before we get into that, let's take a quick pause to let all this information sink in.
Yeah, good idea. We'll be right back to continue our exploration of Concor's Q2 FY25 performance
Yeah.
and what it all means for their future.
Sounds good. Okay, and we're back. Ready to jump back into Concor's Q2 performance? Before the break, we were just starting to touch on the idea of sustainability. It seems like every company these days is talking about it, but it's not always clear what concrete actions they're taking. So what can you tell us about Concor's approach to sustainability?
You're right, sustainability is a hot topic, and it's important to separate the talk from the walk. While the press release doesn't go into a lot of detail on Concor's specific initiatives, I think it's worth noting that the logistics industry as a whole is under increasing pressure to reduce its environmental impact.
Yeah, that makes sense. We're talking about moving massive amounts of goods around the world, which inevitably has an environmental footprint.
Exactly. And in India specifically, there's a growing awareness of the need to make logistics more sustainable. So even though we don't have all the specifics on Concor's current efforts, it's safe to assume that they're aware of this trend and are exploring ways to become more environmentally responsible.
So it's probably a safe bet that we'll be hearing more about their sustainability initiatives in future reports. But for now, let's shift gears and go back to Concor's financial performance. We were talking earlier about their alignment with India's economic growth story. Can you expand on that a bit? How closely is Concor's fate tied to the overall health of the Indian economy?
Well, it's hard to imagine Concor thriving if the Indian economy were to take a downturn. Their business model is fundamentally reliant on the movement of goods both domestically and internationally. And that movement of goods is directly tied to economic activity.
So if India's economy is humming, Concor is likely to benefit. But if things slow down, they could feel the pinch.
Precisely. They're not immune to broader economic forces. But it's not just a one-way street. Concor also plays a role in supporting India's economic growth.
Oh, right. They're not just a passenger on this train. They're actually helping to drive it forward.
Exactly. By providing efficient and reliable logistics solutions, Concor helps facilitate trade and commerce, which in turn contributes to economic growth. So it's a mutually beneficial relationship.
Okay, so it's a two-way street. Concor benefits from a strong Indian economy, but their operations also help fuel that growth. It's a classic win-win scenario. But let's get back to those potential challenges we were discussing earlier. We talked about regulatory changes and global economic uncertainties. Are there any other factors that could impact Concor's performance moving forward?
Well, we can't ignore the competitive landscape. The Indian logistics sector is incredibly dynamic with new players emerging all the time.
Okay.
Concor is a well-established player, but they can't afford to rest on their laurels. They need to constantly innovate and adapt to stay ahead of the curve.
So even with their current strong performance, they can't take anything for granted. Competition is fierce, and they need to keep pushing themselves to stay ahead of the pack.
Exactly, and that's where things like operational efficiency and technological innovation become so important. Those are the factors that will allow them to maintain a competitive edge in the long run.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about Concor's financials, their strategies, the regulatory landscape, the competitive environment, and even touched on sustainability. But I think it's time to bring it all together and answer the big question. What does all this mean for Concor's future?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And of course, there are no easy answers. Predicting the future of any business is a complex exercise, but based on what we've seen, I think there's reason for cautious optimism when it comes to Concor.
Cautious optimism. I like that. So, what are the factors that are making you feel optimistic, and what are the things that warrant caution?
Well, on the optimistic side, you've got a company with a solid track record of profitability, a strong management team, and a clear strategic focus on areas like operational efficiency and cost management. Plus, they're operating in a sector that's closely aligned with India's overall economic growth trajectory.
Those are all definitely points in their favor. But what about the cautionary side? What are the potential pitfalls?
Well, you can never completely eliminate the risk of unforeseen challenges. Regulatory changes could create unexpected headwinds. Global economic conditions can shift rapidly, and competition in the logistics sector is only going to intensify.
So, it's not all smooth sailing ahead. They'll need to navigate some potentially choppy waters.
Exactly. But I think they've demonstrated a willingness to adapt and innovate, which is essential for any company that wants to thrive in the long term.
All right, so we've got a company with a lot of positive momentum, but also some potential challenges on the horizon. Sounds like a classic stay tuned situation.
I'd say that's a fair assessment. It will be interesting to see how they perform in the coming quarters and how they address the challenges and opportunities that inevitably lie ahead.
Well, I know I'll be keeping an eye on them. And for our listeners who are interested in following Concore's journey, I highly recommend checking out their investor relations website and staying up to date on their quarterly reports and announcements. That's where you'll find the most detailed and up-to-date information on their performance and strategic direction.
Excellent point. Information is key for any informed investor.
Now, before we move on, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, the human element of Concore's success. We've been talking a lot about numbers and financial performance, but it's important to remember that behind those numbers are real people.
Absolutely. Concour's success wouldn't be possible without the hard work and dedication of their employees, the truck drivers, the warehouse workers, the logistics coordinators, the IT specialists, and everyone else who contributes to their operations.
Right. It's a massive team effort, and it's easy to lose sight of that when we get caught up in the financial analysis.
I think it's important to acknowledge that a company's success is ultimately driven by its people. They're the ones who bring the strategy to life, who solve problems, who innovate, and who ultimately create value for customers and shareholders.
Well said. So, as we continue our deep dive into Concore's performance, let's keep that human element in mind. It's a reminder that business is not just about numbers, it's about people.
Absolutely. And it's often the people who make the difference between a good company and a truly great one.
All right, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We've explored Concore's financial performance, their strategic initiatives, and the various factors that could impact their future success. Now it's time to shift our focus to one final crucial aspect of their business, their long-term goals and ambitions. What does Concore want to achieve in the years ahead? And how are these Q2 FY25 results shaping their path towards those goals? We're back and ready for the final stretch of our Concore deep dive. We've looked at their numbers, dug into their strategies, and even thought about what India's economic future could hold. Now I'm really curious, what are Concore's long-term ambitions? Where do they see themselves down the road?
That's a great question to wrap things up with. And while the press release doesn't come right out and say, here's our grand vision, there are definitely some clues we can pick up.
Okay, so let's play detective. What hints are they dropping about their long-term goals?
Well, their big focus on the XM segment definitely points to a desire to be a major player in global trade. Remember, India wants to be a global manufacturing and logistics hub, and Concore, with all their expertise in container handling and transportation, they're in a perfect spot to play a key role.
So basically, Concore is tying their success to India's success. If India does well, Concore does well.
It's a smart move, don't you think? They're aligning themselves with a powerful economic force and using their own strengths to benefit from that growth.
Makes sense. What other clues can we find?
Well, their constant focus on operational efficiency tells me they're not just thinking about the short term. They're building a foundation for long-term sustainability and resilience.
So they're in it for the long haul, not just chasing quick wins.
Right, they're thinking about building a business that can last for decades.
Makes sense. And don't forget about their capital expenditures, all the money they're putting into developing infrastructure.
That's a clear sign. They're serious about expanding their capacity and getting ready to meet the demands of the future.
So they're putting their money where their mouth is, they're investing in the future, not just coasting on their current success.
Exactly. And all of this together suggests that Concore is aiming to become a dominant force in Indian logistics, with a strong global presence, too.
That's a pretty big goal. It sounds like they're aiming high.
Well, they are. And based on what we've seen recently, their performance and their strategic moves, I wouldn't bet against them.
Well, I've definitely learned a lot about Concore today. It's a company with a really interesting story, a clear vision, and a lot of potential. But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one last thought-provoking question.
Ooh, I always like a good parting thought. What you got for us?
We talked a lot about Concor's role in India's economic growth story. But India's economy is a complex thing, and it's always changing. What if those ambitious growth targets don't work out? What if there are unexpected problems in the global economy? Can Concor keep doing well if things change?
Yeah, that's a question that gets to the core of any business's future. It's not just about riding the wave when things are good. It's about handling the tough times, too.
Exactly. Can Concor adapt and evolve if the economy takes a turn? Can they stay flexible and keep innovating if there are unexpected disruptions?
Those are the questions that will really decide their long-term success. And it's definitely something for our listeners to think about as they follow Concor's journey.
Well said. I think that's a perfect way to end our deep dive into Concor's Q2 FY25 performance. We've covered a lot today, from the details of their financials to the big aspirations that are driving their future.
It's been a really interesting look. We went through the numbers, analyzed their strategies, and got some great insights into a company that's playing a big role in India's economic transformation.
And I think we've given our listeners plenty to think about as they consider Concor's prospects and make their own investment decisions.
For sure, informed investors make better decisions. And that's what this deep dive is all about. Giving our listeners the knowledge and insights they need to understand the complex world of business and finance.
Well said. So for now, we'll say goodbye to Concor, but the conversation doesn't stop here. We hope our listeners keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never stop diving deep.
On to the next adventure.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Deep Dive. We'll catch you next time.